This isn't your standard video essay about video games. I'm going to break the role of the video essayist here for this introduction because I feel it's important. Think of this as a bit of a preface. Originally, upon finishing The Last of Us Part 2, I thought that none of my friends wanted to continue to hear me rant about my opinion. So, I decided to formulate my thoughts by writing them down, that way I didn't have them bouncing around in my head anymore. It was a big hodgepodge of opinions, not really well organized, and definitely not that great of content. I love discussions and I've always wanted to do YouTube content, but I didn't have any way of creating a video at that time. So, that script sat in the backlog. What this began as was a standard review of The Last of Us Part 2. Now, it's been about 9 months to the day since I wrote my original opinions, and my opinions have changed. What this project has transformed into is something far more captivating in my opinion, a meta-commentary not just about the game itself, but more so surrounding this game. I could have just tweaked my opinions to be what I feel now and have your standard video essay. Rather, I've decided to try something else. I'm going to begin this video by talking about the place that the original Last of Us holds in my heart and why it holds that position. Then I'm going to talk about the content of the sequel, followed by some of my original opinions and why I thought that, and end it with my opinion now. The reason I'm doing it this way is because I feel that The Last of Us Part 2 was much more than a standard sequel in gaming. It was a pop culture zeitgeist for a brief moment, since the news cycle moves so fast now. But this game was absolutely the defining moment of June 2020, and I feel that in order to do this game justice, I should go beyond a normal video essay. This is Citrus Station's meta commentary on The Last of Us Part 2, and why it is one of the most captivating works of art created. Let's discuss. As a generally decisive person, when I get asked what my favorite video game is, I struggle with choosing a game. It's like choosing my favorite child. However, if I'm forced to, my favorite game is probably The Last of Us. And in my opinion, The Last of Us Part 2 is incredibly interesting in terms of a sequel, because it's so distinct from the original. Having just completed the original game in April, the same day the last delay was announced for the sequel, I then completed The Last of Us Part 2 shortly after launch, roughly 2 or so months after my most recent playthrough of the first game. I mentioned how recently I played the first game so that my love for it cannot be attributed to solely nostalgia, as I have played through the game recently enough that I believe it still more than holds the title of a masterpiece, 8 years after release. I still believe that the first game is the better game, but the sequel does so many interesting things that I had to write about it. But let's start on why I think the way that I do about the first game, because in order to talk about how interesting the sequel is, we have to talk about the original game. My opinions about the first game are essentially solidified. The opening moments of the first game are some of the most poignant and beautiful of any game ever, and in those opening moments alone demonstrates why games should be considered as much of an art form as movies or television. I remember just how much the world took notice of The Last of Us, showing the entire world that games could be about more than just shooting the bad guy, and that gaming as a medium has the ability to tell stories that other mediums just cannot give with the same level of nuance. Obviously, mature, well-written stories have existed in gaming for a while before, and I don't mean to imply that The Last of Us was the first game to have a mature, good story. What I do mean to imply, though, however, is that by being so objectively compelling, The Last of Us was able to make waves across the gaming industry. Although this piece is going to be spoiling the entirety of both games, so consider this your spoiler warning, it would probably be best to start at the beginning to add some context to the world of these games. The Last of Us starts with the opening moments of the day later dubbed as Outbreak Day. Worldwide cities and ecosystems crash as a virus takes over the world, transforming the infected people into zombies. The word zombies is in air quotations because the infected are never referred to as zombies in-game. As time passes, these standard running zombies turn into clickers, infected that have had the fungal virus for so long, their entire face is destroyed, making them rely on clicking and echolocation in order to find their prey. Thus the name, Clickers. You play as Joel predominantly in the first game, an older, grizzled man who can remember the days before the outbreak changed the world. As Joel, you are tasked with taking 14-year-old Ellie, who is immune to the virus, across the country in what might be the only chance to develop a vaccine to save humanity. The opening moments of the game are shown from Sarah's perspective, Joel's daughter. You watch helpless as your society collapses around you as the player then switches to Joel to attempt to carry Sarah out of the overrun city and to safety. However, right as you and Sarah reach the bridge out of town, a member of the army stumbles upon you two. This soldier is told to kill you both, and as he starts firing, Joel's brother Tommy just barely kills the soldier. But it is too late, and Sarah has been fatally shot, and Joel cries out over her dying body as the title sequence flashes in. This opening sequence is incredibly visceral. It establishes the stakes of this new world being created, shows the real threat of other humans, and humanizes the protagonist in an understandable and brutal fashion. But this game does not have a case of up syndrome, a self-coined term for when the beginning moments of a piece of media far outweigh the rest of the work. The rest of the game is just as strong as these first moments, but instead of being as explosive, The Last of Us revels in taking its time and allowing the events of the narrative to unfold naturally. Joel begins the game resentful of the fact that he's been forced to take Ellie to the Fireflies to help create a cure, but over the course of the almost 15 hours in-game, the player and Joel begin to bond with Ellie, providing purpose, once again, to a man who lost his purpose when he lost his daughter. The gameplay is like a long road trip, with sections based in each season of the year. Along the way, Joel and Ellie encounter a multitude of characters who they must get along with or fight, and this aspect once again shows one of Naughty Dog's strengths, the ability to build character. Each character that has a role in the original game feels real, so real that if they weren't on screen at that moment, I could take them out to lunch and have a long conversation with them about their beliefs. This ability to build character is what makes Joel's final choice so impactful. At the end of the game, having traveled from Boston to Florida to Colorado to Salt Lake City, Joel and Ellie finally find the headquarters of the Fireflies, who are very clearly at their breaking point. As they arrive, Joel and Ellie are knocked unconscious and brought to the hospital where the doctors will try to create a cure from Ellie. However, Joel learns that in order to begin to create the cure, the doctors would have to kill Ellie. Joel, in order to not lose the person who made him feel whole again, goes on a rampage through the entire hospital, kills the head surgeon, and takes Ellie away from the hospital, jeopardizing the entire world as what might be the only chance for a vaccine vanishes. In the final moments of the game, Joel tells Ellie that the Fireflies are no longer looking for a cure and that there are more immune people like her, outright lying to Ellie. Ellie had stated before that she would be willing to sacrifice herself for a cure, and Joel knows that if he had told Ellie the truth, she would have left him, negating the deed he did to rescue her entirely. The first game ends with Ellie making Joel swear to her that he was telling the truth, which he does, and cuts back to a close-up of Ellie as she replies,
"Okay."
This end choice, on top of the incredible dialogue, cemented this game as a masterpiece. In any other narrative, Joel's choice to murder his way through an entire hospital, stopping the world's chance at a vaccine, would be decisively the actions of the villain. However, since we, the player, have spent the last 15 hours caring for and being with Ellie, the audience can understand Joel's exact motivations as he goes to rescue Ellie. The best discourse therefore arises when, knowing this perspective, do you, the player, agree with what Joel did to save the person he loves? And do you, the player, feel comfortable with the fact that after having murdered so many, you lie to the person whom you murdered for? The game never gives an answer to these questions, and the game never tries to paint Joel's actions as anything other than it is, a selfish act of love. Therefore, the answer as to how much you agree with both previously stated questions are entirely subjective, and I love an ending that allows for discussion long after the release. But this catches us up to the second game. The second game was first announced in 2017, with sparse information coming out about it every 6 months or so. The game suffered multiple delays, first from February 2020 to May, then May to June. An essential aspect when talking about this game is the massive leaks that occurred in May. As of the time of writing, all that is known is that a third party was able to get access to Naughty Dog servers and was subsequently able to find all sorts of footage from the second game, plot points and scenes imperative to the plot that Naughty Dog didn't want revealed until the game was actually playable. These leaks revealed large portions of cutscene footage from the 2-hour mark all the way through to the 18-hour mark. Keep in mind, I'm going to completely and entirely spoil this game, and if the first game sounded interesting, I would highly recommend playing through both of these games and forming your own opinion before listening to mine. We're going to keep going. Being semi-familiar with what was leaked, I would say that as much as 40 to 70% of this game was leaked. However, I feel it is important to note that the final hours of the game were never leaked. But most of the rest of the game was leaked, including the fact that not only does Joel die horrifically in the first couple hours of the game, but then the player has to play as that same murderer for the latter half of the game. I feel that if the leaks hadn't come out, the game would still be wildly controversial, but because the leaks came out right at the highest point of excitement for the game, the leaks were disastrous for public perception. In essence, I feel it was incredibly unfair and unlucky that the game leaked 2 months ahead of release, as it essentially burned every bridge Naughty Dog had before they could let their own game speak. This is because Naughty Dog was literally unable to speak on the topic, because in my opinion, there were probably so many non-disclosure agreements signed about the game, especially due to its sensitive nature, that almost no one would have been able to legally speak on it. In totality, these leaks hurt the game's reputation incredibly, and in a universe where the game never leaked, I think that the game would be looked on much more favorably than it is. After that crucial addition, I think that it's time to talk about the events of The Last of Us Part 2. Okay, let's move forward. The sequel takes place 5 years after the first game. The first 2 hours of the sequel game establish what has happened in the span of time. All that the audience knows is that it seems that Ellie and Joel's relationship has strained from what it was in the first game, but there is an incredibly touching moment when Joel plays Ellie the song Future Days on his guitar. After that, Ellie and Joel go on separate patrols, and the game begins to kick off. The player meets new characters Dina and Jesse during this section. The former is a close friend of Ellie's who had kissed Ellie the night prior, and Jesse is Dina's ex-boyfriend. The inciting incident is when Joel stumbles into a hideout where about 10 people that don't live in Jackson were hiding, and Joel is subsequently tortured. Ellie discovers where Joel is just as these new characters, led by a girl named Abby, beat Joel to death with a golf club. These characters leave back to their hometown of Seattle as Ellie swears revenge for Joel, starting the game off explosively. The first half of the game is spent as Ellie, who travels all over Seattle attempting to hunt down Abby with Dina, who decided to join Ellie, in addition to Tommy, who traveled up to Seattle first, and finally Jesse, who followed Ellie and Dina up. Over the course of 3 days, Ellie kills her way across Seattle to find Abby, murdering almost all of the original crew that Abby brought to Jackson. In addition, Ellie and Dina form a close romantic bond where Ellie finds out that Dina is pregnant with Jesse's child. In the final moments of playing as Ellie, Abby has tracked Ellie's location in Seattle, killing Jesse and shooting Tommy, and setting up a direct confrontation between the two. This is where the game winds the clock back 3 days, and the player then plays through the days Ellie spent in Seattle as Abby, and sees what Abby went through in those days. While this was a divisive decision, I think that I should continue on with the events of the game before adding any of my own thoughts. After all, I gave the first game breathing room to speak for itself. I should do the same here. We begin Abby's section by learning about her home group, the Washington Liberation Front, which will be further referenced as the WLF, and the Seraphites, a rival cult who are warring with the WLF. These Seraphites were present in Ellie's section and led to a change in gameplay, because while the WLF were like standard military enemies, the Seraphites resented technology and utilized bow and arrows while communicating through whistling. The Seraphites and WLF seem to have irreconcilable differences, and the inciting incident for Abby's section arrives when she is captured by Seraphites while out looking for her ex-boyfriend Owen. Abby is rescued by a pair of siblings, Lev and Yara, who have been outcast from the Seraphites after Lev broke Seraphite tradition by transitioning from female to male. Regardless, Abby leaves the two of them to find Owen, who has decided that he has had enough of the fighting between the Seraphites and the WLF and has created a plan to sail for Santa Barbara, California. Abby goes back to find Lev and Yara and proceeds to help the siblings who are fleeing their home. Over the course of her campaign, we see Abby go from calling the Seraphites Scars, a derogatory name, to fully siding with Lev and Yara after multiple hours together and learning more about each other. Lev attempts to go back to the Seraphite home island to find his mother in an attempt to get her to leave, but only ends up causing further strife. At the same time, the WLF attempt a siege of the Seraphite home island, inciting mass-scale war. On this battlefield, Yara is killed, and Lev and Abby just barely manage to escape with their lives. Returning to Owen's last location, Abby finds Owen and his pregnant girlfriend dead, and finds where Ellie is keeping her base of operations in Seattle, catching us up to the end of Ellie's section. I'm going to begin this section with a bit more backstory for Abby and Ellie, because this is my goddamn video essay, and I get to do what I want, Cheryl! The reason that Abby went to go kill Joel in the first place is that Abby's father was the surgeon who attempted to operate on Ellie, and in the first game, the player must kill at least one surgeon when rescuing Ellie. This, unshockingly, destroys Abby emotionally, who spends the next 5 years training for revenge against the man who murdered her father. Additionally, in the time between the first game and the second game, Ellie found out about Joel's actions to save her, resulting in her cutting all contact with Joel. These background motivation reveals are scattered throughout the game and are significantly important in bringing us up to speed when Abby finds Ellie in her base, a local theater. The game proceeds on with Abby, the player, being tasked with chasing down and killing Ellie in the basement of the theater. The fight ends with Abby getting the upper hand and smashing Dina's face repeatedly into the ground. And right as Abby is on the verge of killing Ellie, Lev steps in and asks Abby not to kill her. Abby drops the knife and walks away, telling Ellie to never let her see her again. The game then cuts forward an unspecified amount of time. We find that Dina has given birth to Jesse's child, and Ellie, Dina, and the baby are living a peaceful life on a farm, although Ellie is still haunted by post-traumatic stress after the whole ordeal. Tommy arrives at the farm, missing an eye as a result of his fight with Abby, and tells Ellie where Abby is now. Ellie decides that she needs to go and finish fighting Abby, to which Dina begs Ellie to stay. Ellie decides to go anyway, and she goes to Santa Barbara to find Abby and Lev, and find them captured and close to death, shells of what they were when Ellie fought them months ago. Ellie forces Abby to fight her, and after an exhausting fight between the two where Abby bites off 2 of Ellie's fingers, Ellie overpowers Abby but has a change of heart at the end, and lets Abby leave with Lev. Ellie returns to the farm she and Dina had once shared, and finds the farmhouse deserted, with all signs of Ellie sequestered off into one room. Ellie attempts to play Joel's guitar, and does so poorly with her newly missing fingers. Ellie reminisces on her final conversation with Joel, sets down the guitar, and walks off into the distance, ending the game. Have a look.
You're such an asshole.
I'm not trying to.
I was supposed to die in that hospital. My life would have fucking mattered. But you took that from me.
If somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
Yeah. I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
I'd like that.
Okay. I'll see you around.
Yep.
In my original draft, I spent one whole paragraph talking about the actual content of this sequel game, after giving 3 paragraphs of the far shorter first game. This time, I attempted to allow the game to actually, speak for itself, like I said I would in my leak section. I tried to relay the game in as accurate a way as I can. Ironically, I had initially made a point about how the leaks didn't defend itself, and I proceeded to take away that ability, speeding through the events to air my grievances faster the first time around. To summarize, my main criticisms were the way the game was edited, and the characterization and motivations in this game compared to the first game, which I finished talking about by lightly complimenting the superficial elements of the game, such as the game's visual complexity and the world building. I'll go into each criticism more as I get through them and write why I thought that, but I would like to first say that this section is meant to be more of a reflection. These are not my current thoughts, and my current thoughts will be after this section. I'm just interested in dissecting what my thoughts were at the time and why they were that way. Afterwards, I'll give my opinion as to what I think currently of The Last of Us Part 2. My first criticism was of the game's editing. More specifically, although I didn't touch on it in my overview, when playing as both Abby and Ellie, there are multiple times when the game flashes back to earlier parts of both of their lives. We get to see more of Ellie and Joel as Joel takes Ellie to a natural history museum for her birthday, as Ellie had always loved dinosaurs and the world around her. The player gets to additionally see the relationship between Abby and Owen grow and fluctuate and diminish as we learn more and more about Abby. I specifically said that I, quote, I think the absolute biggest problem in this game is the editing of these sequences, end quote. My reasoning at the time was because I felt that these sequences were the best sequences of the game, and that it led to the story feeling patched together and disjointed. The two issues that I want to point to in regards to editing is to how these sections mesh together into the bigger story, and secondly, how Ellie goes through and murders all of Abby's friends when we don't know who they are. I'll begin by addressing my first issue. The main reason I was so angry about their placement was actually because Naughty Dog did their job so well. What do I mean by that? I mean that specifically for Ellie's flashbacks, these flashbacks channel the energy of the first game immaculately, and it was incredibly frustrating the first time playing for me to see a glimpse of the last game's hope and love through this game's despair. These sections work because of that longing. I can see Ellie thinking of these moments and wishing she was back at the Natural History Museum instead of exterminating the entirety of Seattle. The second issue I also disagree with. The game utilizes dramatic irony by allowing the player to first kill all of Abby's friends when they're the most angry, and then the player sees these people through Abby's eyes. While Abby doesn't know it, these people were sentenced to death at our hand, which leads to an increasing number of doubts as to whether or not Ellie did the right thing. And that seems to be the intention of the developers, to challenge the standing perception of these characters, and to leave a space of moral gray for everyone to dwell in. My second criticism was the characterization and motivations of the characters in this game. Precisely, I thought that the new characters introduced were flat, and that the hidden motivations weren't very cute or a good twist, they are truly infuriating. For example, for my argument about characterization, I stated that Dina feels like she exists solely for the sake of Ellie to have an emotional journey, to which I partially agree. I think that the reason I felt this way was unfounded, but that the criticism itself is founded. I do think that some of these new characters don't have the inherent realness of characters from the original game, and I feel that that's the byproduct of both this game's runtime and the direction for this game. The first game was attempting to paint a picture of what it was like living in the world of The Last of Us, while the second game already thinks you know what it's like, and thus doesn't spend that long grounding its characters to the world. My reason for why this criticism was unfounded when I said it, though, was because I was trying to poke holes in this game to make it seem weaker than the first. And even though the point is valid in my opinion, since I used the wrong formula to get there, I think the criticism is used incorrectly. Then, I talk about the use of hidden motivation. While I understand the intention behind my criticism, I think that this is a choice that I just still don't agree with, and it isn't a bad choice. For instance, the player doesn't know that Ellie was actively trying to heal her relationship with Joel until the second to last scene of the game. This then restructures the whole game once the player knows this knowledge, because it wasn't a girl fighting for an estranged father figure, it was a girl whose attempt to reconcile with her father figure was taken from her. These choices are frustrating because the player doesn't know the intentions of the person they're playing as. But I think that this is a bold choice that serves the narrative, and it's something that as you sit on the experience, the initial anger begins to fade away, and the appreciation for the storytelling remains. In totality, I think that the main problems I had with The Last of Us Part 2 were that it wasn't just more the first game, and as a result, I tried to tear the game down. In addition, the game was so far removed from the first that it seemed to actively frustrate fans at first, and this didn't add to my enjoyment. These two issues compounded so that I resented the game, regardless of its great qualities. However, as time has gone on, I've felt myself literally start to think of this game more favorably. I originally felt that if I would have had to choose a number out of 10 for this game, it would have been probably a 5 or so. If I had to pick right this moment, it'd probably be an 8 or a 9. The reason I feel this game is a true work of art is because of the bold strokes it takes in its creation, and standing strong as a piece of media that is absolutely the vision of one person. As time goes on, more and more mediums feel susceptible to the lure of focus-tested, easy money games that feature explosions and feel-good stories. That's not The Last of Us 2. The director very easily could have just played it safe and taken the player on more Joel and Ellie adventures and made a boatload of money. But as a result of taking a decisive step into something new, the director pissed off a lot of fans. But by doing the new and different, I feel this game is a worthy successor to the first and is an admirable work of art for attempting innovation and all the downsides that coincide with that.